I'm focusing on the whole person, and then I'm creating a space to be able to evoke transformation. I'm deeply listening. I'm really connecting to my intuition. I'm looking for ways to create the space to deepen and forward what the individual's learning about themselves. I'm making sure that I'm self managing myself and making it their experience. And then I'm showing up with deep curiosity.
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.
Welcome back to the Making of a Coach. I'm Tobi from metaFox, and on this episode, I continue my conversation with Kristen Harcourt. On last week's episode, we learned about Kirsten's business building story, her journey from soft skills to emotional intelligence. Today, we dive a bit deeper into her actual coaching practice, and we learn how the coactive coaching framework has shaped her, and also how she's working with emotional intelligence and the EQI assessment today. As usual, I'd love to rather show than just tell you about this. So I actually took the EQI self-assessment that Kirsten usually uses with her clients myself to assess my emotional intelligence, which was quite an interesting process. But before you get to listen to me reflect on my low stress tolerance, let's have Kirsten give us some context on how does this overall coaching journey look like and who are these leaders that she actually works with. Let's go. So it's people who have been particularly good at their job as an individual contributor, and now all of a sudden they are in a leadership position and have to deal with these other things called humans. And how does it then start? Do they come because they have a specific pain or they are sent by their employer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's a variety of different ways that they come through. So sometimes it's because the organization has identified them as high performers and are going to be putting them on a development path when it comes to promotions. And they might be currently a director and they're seeing them being ready to go to the VP level, or they've gone from the VP level to a CEO position. It tends to be, I'd say, a lot of the time, it's the organization identifying that in order to set that person up for success, they should have a coach to support them. I would say that happens around 75% of the time. And then the other 25% of the time is the individual leader might go to the organization. That could be going to HR, going to their boss. Based on some of the things they're experiencing in their role, they could see the benefits of a coach. That might be because they've spoken to their peers, they've talked to others who have really highlighted the benefits of doing coaching. And so they've self identified that would be able to help them. Maybe they're being vulnerable and also sharing that there's some struggles that they're experiencing that perhaps others might not know that they're experiencing on their leadership journey. But definitely, I'd say 75% of the time, it's the organization identifying that need. And then the other 25%, the individual has gone and asked for it.
How does the conversation usually start? What is the first question that you explore with them?
So I would say the first thing that for me is really important is just because an organization approaches me about coaching a leader, I don't take on a coaching engagement until I have a conversation with that individual to get a feel for whether they're actually ready, willing, and eager to go on a coaching journey. Because ultimately, I will create a space where transformation can happen, but I'm not doing the work for that individual, right? So they have to be really ready to make that commitment. So I have what I call a meet and greet and spend some time speaking to that leader and just learning more about their current journey, where they're at, what they're noticing in terms of struggles, where they think they really shine as a leader, and where they notice that they're not always shining. And then what's the impact do they want to have? Like, how do they want to show up as a leader? What does it look like for the fullest expression of their leadership? And getting them to share all of that, sharing their struggles so that we can talk through it. And ultimately, I talk about in a coaching session, it's really around deepening the learning, but then outside of a session, it's really forwarding the action. And that's where we have this accountability built in. And so after that conversation, I'm happy to say, Toby, in over 8 years, every single one of those conversations has led to coaching, but that's because the person has identified, "Yeah, sign me up. I'm ready for that. I'm ready to do more of that self-exploration." They know that my job as their coach is to hold up a mirror and reflect those things in a very loving way where I might be seeing limiting beliefs, where I might be seeing patterns that are holding them back. And they say, I'm ready for that and I need that. And I want someone to be that mirror for me.
So for them, the purpose of this first conversation is to start the journey and also get this I'm signing up for this, I am willing. And for you, I guess it also helps you to understand where is it they are coming from, decide what's next.
Are they ready to make that commitment? And then I always do pre work that goes very deep where they can start to just ask themselves questions around what really matters to them. What are their values? One of the questions I asked, if you could think of 3 things that you'd want people to say, how they remembered you after you die, what would you want them to say? So, them really thinking about what do they want their legacy to be? It's not just about what they're doing as a leader, but who do they want to be? If they were really having people reflect back to them the impact that they had. And so this gets them to start thinking about deeper questions, not just about what are they doing tactically in their day to day, but also how do they want to intentionally show up in their day to day.
Makes sense. What would be next?
In terms of coaching, maybe this might be a good time to talk a little bit more about my coaching model because I think it's helpful. And I know your community of coaches are going to be really relating and connecting to this. What are we doing when we're coaching? What are we doing in terms of creating space?
Yeah, sounds great.
So, the coaching model that I use is from CTI and it's called coactive coaching. So, it's the coactive model. And in the coactive model, I'll just talk about it high level. There's different things that we're holding on to when it comes to that person that we're coaching. And then there's also things that we're being aware of when it comes to self management and how we're showing up in a coaching session. So it has 4 cornerstones. So the 4 cornerstones are when we're going into a coaching session and we're interacting with people, we're always holding people as being naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. I'm focusing on the whole person, and then I'm creating a space to be able to evoke transformation. So, those are the 4 cornerstones of the coactive model. I'm deeply listening. I'm really connecting to my intuition. I'm looking for ways to be able to create the space to deepen and forward what we're learning, what the individual's learning about themselves through the coaching. I'm making sure that I'm self managing myself and not making it about my experience, but their experience. And then I'm showing up with deep curiosity. And I highlight that for you because I think it's important to be able to understand as a coaching what was going on in a coaching session is, and I talk a lot about this when I'm talking to clients, they're coming with a topic, right? So they might say, Kristen, today this is what's most on my mind. This is what I want to dive into for our coaching session. But it never goes in a linear way, right? So it's so interesting. That's what they show up. And if we look at the very end of a session and the arc and where we go and zig and zag and all these different places, you could have never predicted that's where it was going to go because you're just holding space to allow what's going to be able to emerge in that moment to emerge. And of course, I'm constantly asking questions and co-creating in that moment with that individual in that coaching session. I really loved this model when I first started because it gave me a framework to be like, okay, how am I showing up in a coaching session so that I felt a level of trust and also honoring that individual and of course making sure that they're going to get to this place and that actions were happening. But over time what ends up happening is this model just becomes such a part of who you are that you don't even realize that the model is operating. You're just doing it.
How did that look like in the early days when you started out as a young coach and you probably had more of a process still in your mind? How did that process look like?
So I had the model taped up and make sure it was there. And I would sometimes even look at it when I'm coaching to make sure, right? Because it's as we're talking about this, reminding me of a little toddler, like a baby when they're starting to walk, right? When they first start to walk, they're a bit wobbly. And then before you know it, they're not falling, they're just running around, right? And so when you're at that beginning stage, you're a little wobbly, I'd have things to remind me. I'd have anchors. So I would have the model there as an anchor. And then I'd also be aware of what are some of the things as you're beginning as a coach. We're all going to have different places where we might struggle more. So I also had a note that would say, listen, and also silence is okay. So there would be times where I'd ask a question and then there'd be silence because the person is processing and being with that question. Silence is a little uncomfortable. So I'd want to 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. That feels like a lot of time. And I want to say something, I want to feel that. But the magic happens in that moment because they're being with it, answers emerge to them. So when there were certain techniques or elements of coaching that I wanted to work on, I would make sure I would highlight that for myself so that those moments where my natural inclination is to want to go in and fill the space, I would catch myself, and even though everything in my body, it would be very uncomfortable because I'm like, the silence is killing me. I need to say something. And I realized, no, it's in those moments that the breakthroughs, these insights show up for that individual. And it's in the service of them to not feel the silence. So I would practice the different things in the sessions. And then once I felt like I really built that skill, then I might find something else that I'd be working on more so that I could continue to build those skills.
Yeah, accepting the silence or embracing the silence, maybe even.
Yes.
And when you say you had the model taped down, is that this the client is
Yeah.
resourceful, creative, and whole? Is that sort of more this attitude thing, or is there also what else does model mean in this case?
Oh, so the collective model actually has its picture that has the four corners talking about the dancing in the moment, evoking transformation, holding the client as naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And then it's got the circle in the middle. And so maybe this would be a great thing to be able to share in the show notes with your listeners, that this coactive model, so that you can quickly visually look at it.
So if you're listening right now, just take your phone in your hands and check the video. So this coactive model, I hear the foundation of how you work with clients. There's also a bunch of other tools that you are using. And I think your main theme is emotional intelligence. That's something we share, in fact. So the vision of metaFox is also a world embracing emotional intelligence. That's what we work towards. We are all about emotional intelligence. What we meant back then was that we are a lot about enabling people to reflect, to name feelings, and also on a more holistic level have this self-awareness. What are my strengths? What are my triggers? And we got to this model of Daniel Goleman and the four quadrants saying, yeah, it's about me and myself. And on the other hand, others, the social part. And then it's about being aware, observing. And on the other hand, the managing myself or the relationship with others. And
Yes.
you are using a model that is slightly different. Would you say that's exactly where I'm coming from as well? Or how is your approach and your understanding of emotional intelligence different?
I love Daniel Goleman. He's the father. He was the one that really started and got a lot of conversations around this space and has, I can't even remember how many books he's written now, but he's done tons and tons of research and work with people in this space. The model with the EQI 2.0 and EQ 360 that is built through MHS systems, I think when they built their model, it's very similar to the areas that Daniel Goleman is focusing on, but they identified 5 different quadrants instead of 4. And the way they spaced it out and looked at the 15 different dimensions, I think when they were just doing their research and probably with going into organizations and seeing what did they keep on hearing in terms of the specific struggles of EQ, I think that's where they took the model in this direction around the specific areas that they focused on. Very aligned with Daniel Goleman's work as well, because emotional intelligence is emotional intelligence, right? And the things that you're talking about in terms of naming your feelings, and I always talk about you need to name it to tame it, but building up your emotional vocabulary and understanding what's happening in terms of your feelings, understanding your triggers, and being able to self-manage and self-regulate in all of these areas. When we really get to the foundation, it's always been around elements of emotional intelligence that are really causing the struggle because it's usually communicating with others. For me, what made me really gravitate towards this tool and why I really embrace it in my practice is because when I started, I just noticed these common themes that would all show up around the emotional intelligence piece.
I understand. Okay, and so the model of MHS is, you say, very
Mhm.
similar to Daniel
Yeah.
Goleman. I can even put it on screen also here for everybody who's also watching. And what I see
Yeah.
here is that we have these elements of self-perception and self-expression. So I guess that would be
Mhm.
the analog of the Daniel Goleman's self-awareness on the one hand and then
Mhm.
self-management on the other.
Mhm.
We have the
Mhm.
interpersonal aspect. And then I
Mhm.
think what's newly added is the stress management and the decision making, which I guess
Mhm.
these dynamics and these areas and add this like practical element that I imagine is very common challenge in leadership.
It really is, because I think the decision making is so interesting, because I work with a lot of very linear thinkers and they're like, "What do you mean? I get paid to problem solve." It's the way it's being defined. This isn't about you being able to be an effective critical thinker or your ability to problem solve. But when we start to break down that one, it's actually looking at what happens when there are issues that matter greatly to you. So there is an emotional connection to them. You might be showing up in a more reactionary way, which of course impacts dialogue with others, impacts the collaboration, things like that. It does touch on the problem solving and relating it to Daniel Goleman when you were talking about triggering. The problem solving is where we also get into the impulse control. And so impulse control would be very connected to what happens when you're triggered. The impulse control is around self regulation, because in those problems, when we do have high stakes moments, when people say to me, "Oh, I'm very logical. I never bring emotions into my problems." I'm like, that no, when you're in a very high stakes situation. Now, of course, different people have tools in their toolkit and have learned very effective coping strategies. And so that's where we're talking about some of those things, like what happens in those moments when there are more emotions, you are more attached to a certain outcome. Are you being objective still? Are you seeing reality as it is? And then, like you said, the stress management, which, I mean, being in any organization right now, having tools around how to work with stress, because the goal is not to get into an environment where there's not stress. That's just an unrealistic. And stress is actually not a bad thing. It's around what are your coping strategies within those stressful moments so it doesn't become chronic stress, which we know has huge implications when it comes to mental health and physiologically, and can have really long term negative effects.
Thanks for sharing. Let's go back to your practice and into your session room with the client. You said you usually start with the contracting phase, getting their willingness, having them sign up for this process. You explore values, what is important to them. And then let's say you now do this EQI assessment. Maybe firstly, why would you do that? Or when would you bring in that model and that assessment in particular?
Absolutely. So for all leaders that I work with, they would normally do an EQ 360. Just to highlight the differences, there's the EQI 2.0 assessment, which is an individual doing an assessment on themselves. They are giving information and completing a survey and assessing and answering questions based on their own experience and how they would evaluate themselves when it comes to emotional intelligence. And then when we start to take the second component, which is to get into a 360, now we have both halves. We have that individual still completing their own assessment of themselves, but now we're also getting feedback from others. So now we have their direct reports, their peers, their boss, perhaps other stakeholders, vendors they work with are giving their assessment of that individual in that same area. The only time I wouldn't have a leader do a 360 is if they're very new to the role and they haven't had a long term relationship. So if they've been in that particular role 3 to 6 months, it's not as helpful for me to get direct reports to give feedback. They haven't worked with them long enough to be able to give really helpful data. In terms of when I bring the 360 in, it's right towards the beginning of the coaching journey. So after we've worked through our foundation session and really spent time digging through those pre-work questions, which I was talking about earlier, those deeper questions that help them to really understand who they are and their goals of how they want to show up as a leader, we would then bring in the 360 process, which start to finish usually takes about 6 weeks. Every single 360 that I've done, and at this point, over hundreds of 360s, it is always an enlightening process. And sometimes it's enlightening because the leader realizes they're much, much harder on themselves. and the direct feedback they're getting from others is actually telling them that they do really well in an area that they don't necessarily see that in themselves. But other times they might find their relationship with their direct reports is really good, but they're not as good at managing up or managing across. Or other times they're really good at managing across, but notice that they're not doing as well with their direct reports. Let's say they have 7 to 10 direct reports, and half of them are saying, "I love what you're doing, keep doing it," and the other half are saying, "I don't love what you're doing, stop doing it." So it's also recognizing for them as a leader, you're constantly adapting because what works for one person, the other person's saying, "That doesn't work for me at all."
So to summarize, the 360 would mean I, as a leader and your client, I would basically get a survey invite from you, but instead of me filling it myself, I would have my peers, maybe my leaders, and also the team that I'm leading, they would fill this on my behalf.
You would also do it for yourself because it's very helpful to also get there because that's where we can also see where there's contrasts and how you're seeing things. So, for example, someone might rate themselves incredibly high in empathy, and their direct reports and peers say, that's not my experience. So, that's where it's very helpful because they don't know what they don't know. And they might say, "Oh, I think I'm such an empathetic leader." But that's not the feedback that they're getting from others.
Okay. As we are big fans on this podcast and at metaFox in general of don't tell, I would love to
Yes.
make it a bit more tangible now and
Yes.
actually go into that because as we had met previously and you had actually invited me to do the individual survey, the self-assessment for the EQI assessment. And at the same time
Mhm.
at metaFox, we also have this practice of doing 360 surveys once per year, where we basically have certain markers around our values. So it's not exactly the same, but I would say there is also elements of emotional intelligence aspects in there, as
Mhm.
this is something that we also find
Mhm.
super important. And so I
Yeah.
have a bit of data and some graphs here because I was quite surprised about the discrepancy that I found. For example, comparing the ratings that I got from 8 team members here on the one hand, when it comes to things like creating a safe space for self expression, openness, and so on. Here we worked with a scale of 1 to 4. Turned out I was like at 3.88 overall. Then on the 360, on the EQI model, what I've
Mhm.
done here was filling the survey and also scoring myself in this case on
Mhm.
133 items around these themes of leadership development. Ah, no, that's the areas of application. That would make more sense.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful if we could have let's quickly go at the model first, just to because we talked about it very quickly, but I think just being able to highlight the different areas of tools measuring because some people might not be as familiar with Daniel Goleman. So, the EQI 2.0 assessment is looking at 5 different areas of emotional intelligence. And then with each of those areas, 3 dimensions, 15 dimensions of EQ. And so we've got the self perception. So that's very much your internal experience when it comes to emotional intelligence, your ability to understand your emotions, creating space for self actualization, continuing to develop as a leader, as a human. We've got self expression, how you are communicating your feelings, your emotions, how others experience your emotions is through the self expression. We've got interpersonal, right? Your ability to be able to connect, to be able to build deep, meaningful connections. We talked a little bit around the problem solving, right? So, this is not your ability to solve problems, but when emotions are heightened, how do you work through challenging situations? And then the last bucket is looking at stress management, right? There are going to be times where stress comes up, and how do you manage the stress? Do you stay flexible when different things happen that are out of your control that were unexpected? But also when you might be in rooms with people who have different perspectives, can you stay open to those perspectives? And when all of these different things are happening, what does your level of optimism look like? Are you continuing to maintain a really positive attitude through it all? high level. And I love that Tobi is a type of person that definitely he would score high in self-actualization because I want to understand more about this model by going through it and understanding more about myself. So if we go back to what I said before around coaching, this is a perfect type of person to do the assessment because there is an openness and a desire to want to learn more and to be able to put this in practice. One of the things I like to highlight when you're doing an assessment like this, it's your own self-assessment. And you're also a whole person. So when you're answering these questions, some of the questions and the level of depth and where they go, you are not going to always be thinking about this just from a work environment. You're going to be thinking about this in your personal life. So depending on what's going on in your world, personally and professionally, that's going to impact how you answer these questions. And so sometimes it's interesting when you start to see, oh, how come I scored a little bit lower on that particular area? Things might be really great at work, but maybe there's a stressful situation happening at home, and that's bringing up a lot for you. And so when you're answering those questions, it's going to reflect that. So I think it's really important when we talk about this model. This isn't something like where we're looking at personality, where it tends to be very static. This is very much around whatever is going on currently right now in your world. This is what the assessment will reflect. You do this 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, it can shift based on what those changes are and what's happening in your world. I think it's great that you are identifying, if you looked at all these 15 dimensions, super, super strong in these ones, but these other ones are ones that if I was going to pick somewhere where I'd focus some of my time and energy, these would be the ones that I would focus more on. Because even when you were talking, Tobi, around that people, when they were evaluating you, said you were really good at expressing yourself. If we look at this one, you got very high on that particular dimension as well. I think it'd be helpful if we talked a little bit around the dimensions. If we go to the next page after the model, Tobi, we can see all 15. Because this is a podcast and we're going to be doing this very high level, we're not going to go through all the different 15 dimensions, but I do want to highlight, if I was doing this as part of a 1-hour debrief, we would be talking through 2 or 3 areas where we would set some very concrete goals and action items to drill into. But I think for time's sake, for today's conversation, it'd be helpful to even go to the page before the model when we look at your top 3 subscales and then your bottom 3 subscales. And everyone, when I look at this page, they immediately want to go to the bottom 3 subscales. And no, we're not going to start there. So I'm just curious, Tobi, from your perspective, we look at these top 3 areas. And actually, even through some of our conversations, this feels actually quite aligned. I'm not surprised to see this. But what are your thoughts when you see these areas as being your top 3? Does that make sense? Do these show up in your day-to-day as being strong strengths for you?
Yeah, so what we see here is the high-ranking ones are emotional expression, social responsibility, and impulse control. And I would say emotional expression is very much something I find important for us as society or in my relationships, and also devote a lot of my professional life to it. That's not surprising. I feel very comfortable talking about my inner world, and I would say exploring that is also a sort of passion, a hobby. And that also connects really nicely for me with social responsibility, because I think that is also what we need more of in society. So I think many years ago, I decided to study energy technology because I was thinking, okay, we really need to solve the climate crisis, the energy system, make that renewable. And at some point, I realized, working for a few years in that sector, I realized it's actually not a technology problem that we are having, but it's a societal change readiness problem. And that is also what made me switch industry. But what I want to point out here or exemplify, both of these decisions for an industry were very much driven by this sort of, how can I do my part, basically make the world a better place? How can I do my part to help people and us as a society? So overall, I have to say, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I got that from you right away the first time that we met, that even when what you're doing with this podcast, right? It just feels like that social contribution, that being able to, it's not about I and me, but we and being part of something bigger than yourself. I feel like you live and breathe that. It's interesting when you look at the impulse control as well, that's very connected to triggers and understanding your triggers, right? So if you're someone who is spending the time, and you've talked about how important it is in your organization to be aware of our triggers, then it would make sense that you feel comfortable with that, because that's something that you've really implemented, right? You're paying attention to those times and recognizing how can I respond as opposed to reacting in this situation, and really building up those self-management tools and being able to know how to self-regulate, which is awesome. Now, when we look at the bottom three subscales, I think it's interesting to also look at, are there particular situations where you notice this might show up more? So when we look at the stress tolerance. So I'm curious what came up for you when you saw the stress tolerance. Do you see yourself as someone who sometimes stress can be difficult? Do you have a lot of coping strategies? Tell me more. What's your current relationship to stress?
Yeah, that's resonated a lot with what you said about answers might depend on the current circumstances, because I think that's been a topic I've been quite aware recently. And it falls a bit within, I think it's the flip side of this impulse control, because how impulse control is defined here is this ability to plan and follow predefined strategy. And I think the overuse of that high competency is this inability to be flexible, especially when there's no time because there's just too many things going on. You also earlier said people often think of their personal lives when filling this, and that's also very true for me here, because I think in my professional life or as a leader, I'm not sure, but I think probably not many people would name that proactively, saying in stress situations, Tobi really is not functional. They may say I'm inflexible and I like plans. But for this stress tolerance, I was thinking a lot more about my personal life. I don't know, getting in fights or trying to fix whatever my wife is doing when we are in a rush, trying to get somewhere. So there I often can spot these behaviors that when being in this stressful situation that we need to rush and there's many things going on and I'm overwhelmed, I fall into these useless behaviors. Then I start cleaning up things, or I somehow want to set things in order because I really want to have this order in my life and it's not there because everything is a mess. And that's my coping mechanism, which often makes things rather worse than better. So in that sense, it makes a lot of sense to see this here.
Yes, I love that. So thank you, first of all, for sharing that. And my experience, like what you just shared here, Toby, is when we're doing an assessment like that and then we're having a dialogue, and this is why the debriefs and dialogues are so important, because context is everything. When we start to talk through it, they're like, oh, yeah, like in a work environment, it's fine. Like this doesn't show up. But actually, when I'm at home and when my wife and this kind of stuff happens, or my husband and these kind of things, I notice we go into this pattern, and I don't want to be going into this pattern. I want to be doing more of this. And so this is really great, because what you start to notice is, you know what, I'm actually really happy with how it's going on at work with this particular area. The good news is I know I have that ability because I do it just fine at work. So I have it in me. And what does it look like? And of course, relationally, I always say that the people who are closest to us are our best teachers, because those are the people where those patterns show up. So I know it's here. And I hear you saying you're very invested in your personal development. So if I'm going to take it to the next level, I notice I'm doing all of these things quite well at work. What would it look like to focus a little bit more on, if I normally do X, Y, Z in this kind of situation, what do I want to do instead? What do I want to do differently? I notice my coping strategy is, oh, I'm feeling a lot of emotions. And to work through those emotions, I start tidying, I start cleaning because I'm trying to find something to control. And then maybe significant others, what's going on here? As an example, just because we're talking about it, and I think I really appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing. How would you like to approach that differently? If you were in this moment, just thinking about in those moments, and even taking in some of the ways you might, a stressful situation at work where you might do it differently, what might you want to shift here?
Yeah. So I'm sure this also shows up at work. I just believe I managed to organize my work in such a way that I am exposed to it less. But I would love if I can go into a meeting less prepared and embracing the stressful situation by just leaning into it and being more flexible. It has been a theme, something that I've become aware of in the last months, I'd say. My answer is leaning into it and being okay with the stressful situation. The other low scoring item here is the independence, which I think is related because when it comes, for example, to facilitating a meeting or having a one-on-one conversation, I like to be prepared. That's because I
Yes.
care a lot what other people think. And so I think I can also
Right.
work on that stress tolerance.
What I hear you saying is the growth edge is your default is to make sure everything is as much as possible 100% plans and what might be possible. And I don't want you to go from one extreme to the other extreme, right? You can still have some planning, right? Maybe you just have some bullets, but maybe you don't have it all formulated and you allow what could possibly emerge in that moment. So it sounds like a bit more self trust and a bit more surrendering and letting go, being able to see what happens in that moment, and maybe something beautiful gets created that wouldn't have gotten created if there was so much formalized planning. I also hear you saying there's some opportunity around, there could be a bit of a limiting belief around the people pleasing. And this is a saboteur that shows up with many people. We've been conditioned what might be possible if you allowed yourself a little bit more of the letting go. It doesn't necessarily go perfectly as you thought it would. And yet there's another element of deeper trust or something else that gets created that wouldn't have gotten created if you didn't let yourself let go of some of that control.
I don't have a very clear idea of how to get there.
So if you were just allow yourself to take one step towards this new version, it would be perhaps showing up in the meeting with maybe less plans. But I'm just curious from your end, if you were taking one baby step in that direction, what might it look like?
Yeah, so I think actually, even with this episode and us exploring your topic in the beginning or your methods, the frameworks you're working with, exploring this before we dive into your becoming a coach, that is something, it might sound crazy, but that is even something of me saying, okay, I let go of the tried and tested path because usually we would first explore with our guest how did they become who they are, how did they build their business, and then explore how do they work with today with their clients. And we just flipped that, right? So we are now doing this one first. And I guess as simple as that sounds, that is already me getting out of my comfort zone and seeing, oh, maybe let's actually try that.
Yeah, I love it. That's so true. Right? So you just did it. Like you did it today. Congratulations to you. You just did something where you hit your edges. You allowed yourself to experiment and go out of your comfort zone a little bit more. So I would say what I'm hearing for you in terms of the growth edge, which you could continue to explore, is if you have a certain way you normally do, and this is the plan and this is the formula, what does it look like to challenge yourself to sometimes flip it and do things differently than you normally would and see what might happen?
Yeah. And then this, of course, also connects very much to leadership. Like you said in the beginning, the classic struggle is for a leader being or believing to be the most competent person on the job also. And then this challenge of letting go and saying, okay, let's have the team do it their way.
Absolutely, right? It's being able to, this is something that shows up with leaders quite often because the letting go and recognizing the version's going to look a little bit different, but it's a disservice to not let that person start working on it because how are they going to build the skill?
I'm wondering if this was a real coaching conversation, and this we are trying to demo this here. But how would I now work with this report more? Because I did the self-assessment, I got back a huge
Mhm,
report for all of these items now.
mhm,
I have a page with advice. Here we have the stress
mhm.
tolerance, the lowest scoring area. How would you do
Yeah.
this now with a client? What would you ask me? What would we do?
Yes. When I'm using a tool like this with a client, it's used foundationally to be able to help us identify what are those goals for coaching. The report then would be something that they would have for themselves. And sometimes they would be going back to. So, for example, with us talking today, If we went further into this, we might say, yeah, those top 3 areas are the ones that you've identified you wanted to work more on. And we can't be working on all these goals all at once. So you might only just say 1 or 2 and say, okay, you know what? For right now, I really want to work on the stress. And so I'm going to go to that one page and I'm going to read through some of those things and then say, what are some specific actionable goals I could set around that? That's what I would say for you, and based on our conversation we've talked about today. When I'm working with an individual, we would actually say, okay, these are some of the things we've identified. Someone is being challenged with performance. Instead of giving the direct feedback in real time, they might wait till 6 months later when it's a performance review, which is very ineffective because they've now had 6 months when that person is continuing that behavior, right? So if we're going to set a goal around it, we would say, okay, so tangibly, if we're going to work on that, what does this look like? We might say, okay, so the goal is going to be that this individual is going to be having more one-on-one conversations with their direct reports. In those conversations, they're going to be giving them consistent feedback around what they're doing really well and where there are opportunities for development. Ultimately, there are some behaviors, there are some ways that they're trying to protect themselves for why they're not having those difficult conversations in the first place. And it's not like they're just going to wake up one morning and be like, oh, now it's so fun to have difficult conversations, I'm going to do it all the time. It's going to be something that they're working on. And then I'm coaching them and we're talking through when they have times that feel more uncomfortable or it didn't go as well. Sometimes we're doing role playing in a session as well so that they can practice saying what they need to say. So they're building that muscle. You can't just go to the gym once. You have to be consistent. You have to do the reps. It's a long-term strategy. It's the same thing for this. Once we've identified what those goals are, so if we talk through you, Tobi, with the stress and noticing what some of those natural defaults are, it's not like you're going to all of a sudden be like, oh, I'm going to show up in all conversations with my wife completely different now. And with coaching, I'd be saying, so how's it going? What worked well? What didn't go well? And you're experimenting and practicing. And coaching is where you have that safe space with that person who's championing you as you keep on working on those skills.
So trying to abstract it a bit, in our example, I filled the self-assessment. I got a huge report. This is more of a conversation prompt. So you are actually mostly working with those top 3 and bottom 3 areas and take it from there, then going in a grow model, right? You asked me, how would it look like if I was more stress tolerant? And then, okay, what could you do to actually test that, going from goals to options, if I heard that right? Yeah.
Yes. The one thing that would be happening in a coaching session, we go much deeper, is I want to get underneath where did that come from in the first place? So when we think about the ways that you're maybe holding yourself back in those situations or running into those patterns, we would want to get underneath where did that coping strategy come from? Because there's a reason why you're also doing that behavior. It's working for you in some ways as well. I want to highlight that part too. We don't get just immediately into action. There's also going to be some more deeper work to uncover why that behavior is happening in the first place.
So that means you would ask me, like, how do I benefit from cleaning up when being in a stressful
Right.
situation?
Or how does this pattern, because it's a dance that you're co-creating with your wife, like how is it serving you? There's a reason why you're also engaging in it. So getting underneath some of that. And then also there's usually when we did identify one around the people pleasing, right? Because a lot of times there's limiting beliefs that get uncovered as well. And limiting beliefs are often coping strategies that were created to be able to protect you and to be able to function in the world. But sometimes those coping strategies, and especially if they're limiting, they're no longer working. But it's still understanding why were they created in the first place. And that can help with the behavior change as well.
Yeah, and I guess that would mean exploring, where does it come from? Where did maybe younger Tobi benefit from being less
Right.
independent? I'm very blessed working with a business partner who is really good at decision making. So I can also lean back there a bit, let him take the lead.
And then just figuring out, like you might also say, oh, maybe there's something about me stepping back and always having him make the decisions. Maybe there's ways that I'm holding myself back by not articulating some of my ideas. Something that can be an incredible strength in certain situations can be a blind spot in others, right? So it's just uncovering what might work for you really well here. Maybe it's holding you back in these other ways. And so that's where you're continuing to identify what that looks like.
Nice. How long would that process go? You're working with a leader. You did that sort of values. How do you want to show up as a leader? Is there something else? What have we not covered that would be part of a journey?
So I always work with clients for at least 6 months. Many clients, it's for a year, sometimes multiple years, because this is now ongoing, right? These are all the foundational elements we've talked about. Now it's about putting it into practice. So this is where they're bringing all the real life topics. So let's get underneath what was going on there. And so this is where we're really working on cementing the behavior change. And coaching is where you have that supports someone championing you and holding you accountable as you continue down that path. And that's why I don't work with organizations for less than 6 months, because I don't believe I can help a leader get there after a couple of coaching sessions. That's just creating a lot of awareness. But now they need to put that awareness into practice and create consistent action.
And how often do you meet them?
We try to do it bi-weekly. So every 2 weeks is nice. I find it keeps that momentum going. Just recognizing, though, with executives that they're sometimes doing a lot of traveling. I might do traveling. So sometimes it ends up being more like 3 weeks to a month.
It sounds like you're meeting them in person more than online.
Coaching's always done online. I have a couple of clients who are local, but in general, I'm a global practice. So I'm working with individuals all over. I might be traveling for keynoting or doing in-person training sessions, or they will be traveling as part of their job.
Okay. Is there anything that you think we should still mention when it comes to your work with clients, the coactive model, the EQ?
Yeah, I think the important piece around coaching that I always emphasize, and I talk about this with speaking as well, because I always have people who are brand new speakers and say, oh, how can I get out there? And I want to be on these big stages. And I said, you have to do the miles. It takes time. I think, especially when I was first starting in the first couple of years as a coach, I would do everything in my power to be coaching constantly. Sometimes that would be pro bono. I would just be wanting to do as much as I could to get the hours, because I knew the more I got the hours, the more I would get the confidence and feel really comfortable in the model, which is going to make me for sure more effective as a coach. But then also building your business, the more confident you are in what you do, the more you're going to be able to sell that when you're talking to organizations, because you have evidence that you can speak to of the transformations you're creating.
Get the hours. These are the closing words from Kristen Harcourt. And if you want to follow Kirsten's path and do the hours with the coactive coaching framework, we linked the book classic on the model in our show notes. If you want to get certified with the EQI assessment tool, we also linked this one in the show notes. In my personal experience as a client with the EQI, I really did lack the EQ 360 feedback part, because some statements from the self-assessment report were simply quite inconsistent with the feedback that I got from others. And this is why at metaFox we are intertwining self-assessment and peer feedback very closely with our very first own diagnostics tool, the metaFox Strength Explorer. We are about to launch that on metafox.eu/strengths. For sure, the tool will evolve in the months to come. We are also working with the scientific guidance from a university partner here, but you can already start using the beta version entirely for free right now on metafox.eu/strengths. So much about our small ad here. Also, so much for today's episode. If you enjoyed this, please share it with a friend, leave a rating, and follow us on your favorite podcast app. I'm Tobi from metaFox, and on our next episode, spoiler, I'm meeting yet another Kirsten. That is only 1 week away. Until then, all the best and bye-bye.